Whether you know it or not, you use layers in every single game of Magic you play, and they often get a bad rep for being one of the hardest rules in the game to learn, but I'm here to destroy that myth and give you an easily digestible guide to layers so you can work out even the most complicated of interactions. I'm also going to teach you the secret layers jutsu to stop Magus of the Moon. As always, I'm going to start at the beginning, build the foundation, and work towards some more advanced examples and rules. So with that being said, let's jump into it. So what are layers even about? The layers system is the way we order and apply multiple continuous effects to a board state. Wait, so what are continuous effects? As per rule 611.1, a continuous effect modifies characteristics of objects, modifies control of objects, or affects the players or the rules of the game for a fixed or indefinite period. And then, rule 611.2 tells us that a continuous effect may be generated by the resolution of a spell or an ability. Basically, something that changes the printed information on a card, changes the controller of something, or changes the rules of the game that is produced by a static ability or resolving a spell. For example, casting Giant Growth on a creature and pumping it up +3/+3 until end of turn. That power and toughness buff is a continuous effect. The effect making spells cheaper on Helm of Awakening is a continuous effect. And winter making players have smaller hand sizes is also a continuous effect. Also, to clarify, if I or the rules mention the word object, that means anything in the game. The glossary in the comprehensive rules says an object is an ability on the stack, a card, a copy of a card, an emblem, a token, a spell, or a permanent. Now, let's jump into what each of the layers are so we know what to start looking for. Starting at layer 1, we have copy effects. Examples of this would include clone or true polymorph. This layer also includes effects from mutate and effects that set the characteristics of a card being played face down. For example, Cyber Conversion turns a creature face down and makes it a 2/2 Cyberman artifact creature. This first layer effectively defines and sets what the copyable values are for a card. This is why when you cast Clone, copying a clone that's a copy of Grizzly Bears, your clone will become a Grizzly Bear and not a 0/0 clone. As it's also the reason why clones don't copy any buffs or other effects that might have been applied to the card you're copying. In layer 2, we have control changing effects, so things like mind control and act of treason. Anything that would change the controller of something. Simple enough. In layer 3, we have text changing effects, anything that would change the text on an object. Probably the most well-known modern example of this would be Deadpool Trading Card, a card that swaps an entire text box with another creature. And then there's cards like Witness Protection and Psychic Paper that can change the names of cards. In layer 4, we have type changing effects, an effect that would add, change, or remove any object's type, supertype, or subtype. Probably the two most well-known cards for this particular layer are Magus of the Moon, which changes all non-basics into mountains, and Bellow, Bard of the Brambles, which gives your 4 or greater mana value, non-equipment artifacts, and non-aura enchantments the creature type and elemental subtype. Effectively, you're looking for anything that would change this part of the card right here. Any card with Changeling would be another great example. In layer 5, we deal with color changing effects, for example the one on Painter's Servant or the ones on the Mandland abilities. In layer 6, we have ability adding or removing effects. Probably the most contentious layer for a reason we'll discuss later. It's on this layer where we'll add or remove abilities from objects. A good example of this would be Dress Down or a Chroma's Will. This layer also includes any keyword counters like the ones a permanent gets from Perenation. And finally, we have layer 7, the layer that deals with power and toughness changing effects. In this layer, it's broken down into 4 sub-layers. In layer 7A, we have effects that define power and or toughness through a CDA. Tarmogoyf or Lord of Extinction are the classic examples here. Effectively, it's the layer that defines what the stars are on a card. In layer 7B, we have effects that specifically set the power and toughness of an object. For example, diminish. Look out for the words base power and toughness. In layer 7C, we have effects that increase or decrease power and toughness. For example, giant growth or toxic deluge. This layer also includes +1/+1 and -1/-1 counters. And finally, in layer 7D, we have effects that swap power and toughness, like the one on Inside Out. Whew. So that's the 7 layers. It's also worth noting that yes, a single card can affect multiple layers. For example, Snake Form has continuous effects on layers 6, 5, 4, and 7B. Now we know what the layers are, it's time to learn how to apply them. To put it simply, you take a board state, find all the continuous effects that are currently being applied to it via spells or abilities controlled by all players, and then you apply them to the board state in the order of the layers list from top to bottom. And as per rule 613.5, the layers are constantly checked and applied instantly. It's also important to note that as you're going down the layers list, once you apply a layer, it effectively gets locked in and you can't go back up to that layer to change something. Think of the layers like painting on a canvas. We apply the first layer of paint, and then the second, and so on. But once we get to the 6th layer, we can't then go back and change something on the 4th layer. It's already been painted on. We'll come back to this rule in a bit. Let's look at a quick basic example. Let's say we cast Cyberdrive Awakener while we have a Soul Ring in play. Once we resolve Cyberdrive's ability, we've got some layers to apply. So in this case, we start at layer 4. Each non-creature artifact we control becomes an artifact creature. We then move to layer 6 and give our other artifact creatures flying. And then we move to layer 7B and set their power and toughness to 4/4. Okay, so that seems easy enough. And don't forget, this happens instantly. And if there were any other continuous effects, we would apply those at the same time. Again, more on that shortly. There's 2 more really important examples I want to cover. Say I have a Benelish Marshal in play. It says other creatures you control get +1/+1, and then my opponent casts a Humble targeting it, which says until end of turn, target creature loses all abilities and has base power and toughness 0/1. So again, let's see what layers we're dealing with here. Benelish Marshal pumps up creatures, so that's layer 7C. Humble removes all abilities at layer 6 and sets power and toughness at layer 7B. Now we'll apply the layers. We'll start at layer 6 and remove all abilities from Benelish Marshal. Now because this effect has removed the Marshal's ability before they could start to apply it, it gets removed completely and won't be applied to the board state. So now all we do is move to layer 7B and set the Marshal to be a 0/1. The easiest way to remember this is that the upper layers can impact the lower layers, but not the other way around. Let's look at this classic example before we move on. What happens when we have a humility in play that says all creatures lose all abilities and have base power and toughness 1-1. And then we play a Magus of the Moon, which says non-basic lands are mountains. So first, let's see what layers are being impacted. We have Magus of the Moon changing land types, so that's layer 4. We then have Humility removing all abilities from creatures, that's layer 6. And then we have Humility setting creatures' power and toughness to 1-1, so that's layer 7b. We'll then go to apply the layers in order. We'll start at layer 4 and change non-basic lands into mountains. We'll then move to layer 6 and remove Magus of the Moon's ability, and then we'll jump to layer 7b and set Magus's power and toughness to be 1-1. Now here's the kicker, non-basic lands will still be mountains. Now hold on, before you jump to the comments to start typing up a storm and telling me how wrong and stupid I am, I'm looking at you, Read F10. Let's go through the rules. Rule 613.6 tells us, if an effect starts to apply in one layer and or sublayer, it will continue to be applied to the same set of objects in each other applicable layer and or sublayers, even if the ability generating the effect is removed during this process. So this is what I mentioned before. Once we apply a layer, it effectively gets locked in, and removing that ability later on, for example in layer 6, won't stop that ability from applying. Now, Magus's effect only impacts a single layer, but this locked in rule also applies to abilities that impacts multiple layers. For example, Kudo, King Among Bears, and Bello, Bard of the Brambles. Both of these cards start applying at layer 4, so by the time we get to layer 6 with Humility and remove their abilities, Bello and Kudo will continue to apply their effects all the way down to layer 7b, where they'll set power and toughness to their relevant amounts. Another great example is simply Clone. If we have a clone in play and then someone casts Humility, Clone won't suddenly stop being a copy of something. This is the same reason as Magus of the Moon and Bello. Clone's effect starts applying in layer 1 before it gets removed in layer 6, so it will continue to apply. Now for those of you wondering, well, how do we stop Bello or Magus of the Moon? We first need to learn about the next two things, timestamps and dependencies. Now, if you've learned something thus far, be sure to give the video a like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Let's continue. So now we know how to apply individual layers. We simply apply them in order of the layers list from top to bottom, and the upper layers can impact the lower layers. But what happens if we have some abilities interacting on the same layer? For example, what if I had a Magus of the Moon in play, which impacts layer 4, and our opponent had Harbinger of the Seas, which also impacts layer 4? Would non-basic lands be mountains or islands? Which order would we apply these continuous effects? And this is where timestamps come into play. As per rule 613.7, within a layer or sublayer, determining which order effects are applied in is usually done using a timestamp system. An effect with an earlier timestamp is applied before an effect with a later timestamp. A timestamp is simply an invisible marker that keeps track of the order of continuous effects. Now just to clarify, there's 3 ways that a continuous effect can be produced. By a resolution of a spell, like Giant Growth, the resolution of an ability, like the one on Shivan Dragon, or the static ability of a permanent, emblem, or something similar. Continuous effects are given timestamps upon the resolution of the spell or ability generating them, or when the permanent with a continuous effect enters a zone. Let's quickly go through an example. I have a grizzly bear in play. My opponent cast Diminish on it, setting its power and toughness to 1/1. When this spell resolves, it gets a timestamp. I then cast Almost Perfect, an aura which sets the enchanted creature's base power and toughness to 9/10. When this aura enters, it gets a later timestamp. So when we go to apply the layers, when we get to 7B, we will apply the power setting effects in timestamp order, oldest to newest. So we'll set the bear to be a 1/1, and then we'll set it to be a 9/10. Now I mentioned before a couple of ways things get timestamps. There's a few others you should keep in mind too. Counters individually get timestamps when placed on something. This is mostly important for ability counters. Auras, equipment, and fortification get new timestamps each time they become attached to something. Permanents get a new timestamp each time they're turned face up or face down. And transforming permanents get a new timestamp each time they transform. And while I mentioned a permanent gets a timestamp when it enters a zone, it's worth pointing out that that means that permanent will get a new timestamp anytime it is blinked or flickered, which can become relevant for the first example we started this section with. If I played Magus of the Moon on my turn, and then my opponent played Harbinger of the Seas on their turn, what would non-basic lands be? So we already know that each of these effects applies on layer 4, but now we know we apply them in timestamp order. So because the Magus of the Moon entered the battlefield first, we apply Magus first, then the Harbinger, meaning all non-basic lands will be islands. Two more things we need to cover about timestamps before we move on. Firstly, if multiple objects enter a zone at the same time, we give them timestamps in AppNap order. So the active player chooses the timestamp order for everything they control that's entering, and then the next player in turn order does the same, and so on. And finally, and this only really applies to Zoo from Edge of Eternities, and a handful of other effects, if a continuous effect generated by a static ability of an object and a continuous effect generated by a resolving spell or ability that applies to that object would receive a timestamp simultaneously, such as due to an effect that puts that object onto the battlefield and sets its characteristics, the continuous effect from the object's own static ability receives an earlier timestamp. Basically, all this means is that the effect bringing the object into play will apply its abilities last. The only examples I can think of to demonstrate this is if Zoo brought back a Changeling, the Changeling would give itself every creature type in layer 4 first, then Zoo would change it to be just a skeleton. Now, while we generally apply continuous effects on the same layer in timestamp order, sometimes this order is changed due to dependencies. Let's cover a quick example. On my turn, I cast March of the Machines, which says each non-creature artifact is an artifact creature with power and toughness equal to its mana value. I then play Mycosynth Lattice, which says all permanents are artifacts in addition to their other types. The key thing to call attention to here is that March of the Machines and Mycosynth Lattice both impact layer 4. March of the Machines turns artifacts into creatures, and Mycosynth Lattice turns things into artifacts. So if we applied these effects in timestamp order, we would have a situation where only the artifacts in play when we cast March of the Machines would become creatures, and there would be a number of permanents which are made into artifacts, thanks to Mycosynth Lattice, that wouldn't be creatures. And that's not right. This is where dependencies come into play. As per rule 613.8a, there's a 3-step check to see if a dependency exists. An effect is said to depend on another if A, it's applied in the same layer, and if applicable, sublayer, as the other effect, B, applying the other would change the text or the existence of the first effect, what it applies to, or what it does to any of the things it applies to. And C, neither effect is from a characteristic defining ability, or both effects are from characteristic defining abilities. So going back to our March of the Machines Microsynth Lattice example, both of these effects apply on the same layer. Tick. March of the Machines would apply to more permanents if the Microsynth effect was applied first, i.e. applying the other would change what it would apply to. And finally, neither of these effects are characteristic defining abilities. So in this case, March of the Machines is dependent on Microsynth Lattice. So in this example, we would ignore timestamps and Microsynth Lattice would be applied before March of the Machines. It's worth pointing out that if there were any other effects to be applied on this layer, they would be applied in timestamp order. The easiest way to see if something is a dependency or not is to take your two effects, let's call them A and B, apply A to the board state first, then apply B, and see what the board state looks like. Then undo that, and then apply them in the opposite order. If A applies to different things, or now doesn't apply at all, A's effect is dependent on B. Let's look at some more examples. Blood Moon and Urborg. If we apply Urborg first, it makes everything a swamp, and then Blood Moon removes Urborg's ability and turns it into a mountain. If we swap the order, Blood Moon makes Urborg a mountain, and Urborg no longer has an ability to apply. So here we have a case of applying the other would change the text or the existence of the first effect. So in this case, Urborg is dependent on Blood Moon. Another example would be having Kwende in play and giving another creature first strike with Kindled Fury. If we applied the effects in timestamp order, the creature buff with Kindled Fury would not gain double strike, but applied the other way around, Kwende would give them double strike. For our final example, I'm going to teach you a secret jutsu you need to know to stop Magus of the Moon and Bellow. So looking at Magus of the Moon and Bellow, they both start applying in layer 4. So we need an effect that impacts here. Check out Song of the Dryads, an enchantment that makes enchanted permanent a colorless forest. Looking at the layers of this card, we can see that it applies in layers 4 and layers 5. Now one other rule we need to know that I'll quickly mention is rule 305.7, which basically says if a land has its type set to one or more of the basic land types, it loses all of its abilities. This is why Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon turn off non-basic land abilities. So knowing this, when Magus of the Moon is enchanted by Song of the Dryads, they'll lose all of their abilities. So as we've previously discussed, if an effect would change the text or existence of the first, Magus of the Moon being the first effect, there is a dependency. So here, Magus and Bellow would be dependent on Song of the Dryads, so they'll lose all of their abilities before they can even start to apply. Of course, you can just destroy them, turn them into a Cybermen, or make them a copy of something else, but you know what they say, the more you know. Speaking of, I know that when people see this example, they're immediately going to ask about Magus of the Moon and Imprisoned in the Moon. So let's go through this and explain why it's not the same. Okay, so Magus applies on layer 4, Imprisoned in the Moon applies on layers 5, 4, and 6. Let's apply the layers. So to start, we have Magus making things mountains, and Imprisoned wanting to make Magus a land. So we have a dependency here. So we'll make Magus a land. Here's the really important call out. Making something a land doesn't inherently remove the permanence rules text. It's making something a land and giving it a basic land type which will do so. So again, Imprisoned will make Magus a land. They'll still have their abilities. We'll then make all non-basic lands mountains, which will also include Magus. But like we've mentioned before, once an ability starts to apply, removing it doesn't stop it from applying. So Magus will continue to be a non-basic mountain. We'll then get to layer 5 and make Magus of the Moon colorless, and then go to layer 6 and remove Magus's intrinsic tap to add red ability, thanks to being a mountain, and replace that with tap add a colorless. So the final result is that all non-basic lands will be mountains, and Magus of the Moon will be a colorless mountain that can only tap for colorless. The last thing we need to mention about dependencies is dependency loops. Now, in my entire history of playing Magic, I have never seen a dependency loop in any of the games I've played. But all they are is, imagine you have 3 effects, A, B, and C, and each of these effects depends on each other. This is where a dependency loop forms. Rule 613.8c tells us that if a loop forms, we simply apply the effects in timestamp order. Now, I'm going to link to some resources below if you want to dive further into dependency loops, but as I've mentioned, it's unlikely you'll come across them in a real game. Okay, final thing we need to cover is Rule 613.11, which tells us about effects that aren't included on the 7 layers. Things that change the rules of the game instead of impacting individual objects. Effects that change players' hand sizes or forcing creatures to attack. These are applied after everything else and are applied in timestamp order. Alright, this is it. Final test time. I control Null Rod, New Rock Transmuter, and March of the Machines. I activate New Rock Transmuter's second ability, targeting the Null Rod. After the ability resolves, what does Null Rod look like? I'll leave the answer in the pinned comment below, as this video has gone on long enough. Now, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. Be sure to like the video if you learned something, and subscribe, because if you don't, Wizards won't release the secret 8th layer. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.